Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by our friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the one-stop shop for people interested in animal studies, animals in art, animal advocacy. Membership is just $50. I'm a member of ASA. If you're not a member of ASA, you should be. Please join today. Now, not only is this episode brought to you by ASA, but I'm actually recording it at the 2017 ASA conference, which is being held at the University of Adelaide. So it's a really fantastic opportunity for me to speak to people who otherwise don't live near me or who aren't easy to otherwise interview. And this episode, I have another fabulous guest, someone who'll be very well known to many listeners of Knowing Animals. So, in this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Knight. Andrew is a professor of animal welfare and ethics and director of the Centre for Animal Welfare at the University of Winchester. Today, we're going to discuss Andrew's latest publication, which is Was Jack the Ripper a Slaughterman? Human-Animal Violence and the World's Most Infamous Serial Killer. Now, this paper is available free for anyone who would like to have a look at it. It came out in the journal Animals in 2017. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you.
So, Andrew, can you start by telling us what led you to do this work?
It was not intentional, that's for sure. Essentially, my lovely partner decided to take me on a mystery tour for my birthday when we were living in London many years ago. And so I was required to report to Whitechapel Station at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday night. And when I did so, I found there were about 30 people milling around on a footpath, apparently waiting for something. And pretty soon the mystery was over, and it was that we were going off on a Jack the Ripper tour of East London. And so I spent the next couple of hours actually touring all the locations where Jack's murder victims had been found and all the other historical locations associated with the case. And as I did so, I started to see things that started to make me suspicious of the theory that he must have been surgically trained. It's thought that he had some kind of anatomical ability because he was able to dissect his victims essentially and appropriate organs from a number of these victims very, very quickly and with quite a high degree of skill. So this led to a theory that he must have been surgically trained. But as I say, I started seeing things in the old grainy black and white photographs that the tour guides were showing us that made me suspicious of the theory that he had been a surgeon. So that's how I got started in all of this.
So, Andrew, it's possible that some of our listeners, perhaps some of our international listeners, may not know who Jack the Ripper is. Can you tell us a little bit about who Jack the Ripper is or was?
Jack the Ripper is the world's most infamous serial killer. He was responsible for murdering 5 ladies in East London in 1888. And the extraordinary brutality of the murders, the women all had their throats cut prior to abdominal mutilation, which was severe, and several of them had organs stolen. The extraordinary brutality of these murders was unprecedented in modern times, and this combined with the inability of the police to actually catch Jack the Ripper and subsequently the local vigilante committee led to massive interest in the case, which remains strong to this very day.
Now, we should say for listeners who aren't familiar with your work that you know quite a lot about surgery because you yourself are a surgeon, you're a veterinarian surgeon. Now, can you start by telling us a little bit about the lives of animals at this time in British history?
Well, the relevant part is the treatment of animals in slaughterhouses in the 1880s in East London. It was a bit different from today because today we have refrigeration, we have a road transportation network, we have trucks and industrialisation of animal slaughtering. Back then, none of those things existed, so there was a rapidly increasing population in London, and consequently there were hundreds of thousands of animals actually being driven into London and being sold in the meat markets of the time. The biggest one of those was in the neighbouring district right next to Whitechapel. And those animals had to be killed where all the people lived, because there was no refrigeration, was no transportation network. So there are a very large number of small-scale slaughterhouses within which conditions for both animals and workers was fairly dire. It was common that these animals, these cows, these sheep, these pigs, would be stunned by being poleaxed. Now, poleaxe is basically a sort of a large blunt axe, and people would swing those in an attempt to try to stun these animals prior to throat cutting, which is also what continues today. So these animals were treated particularly cruelly, and conditions for the workers was also poor. The work was extremely physically demanding, it was dangerous, and people worked throughout the night as well as during the day.
So you have a range of reasons for suspecting that Jack the Ripper may have been a slaughterman, of which you note there were many living in that part of London at that time. Can you run us through some of the pieces of evidence that you think point in this direction?
It's believed that Jack the Ripper must have had considerable dissection skill and experience, because he stole organs from most of his victims, and he did so very, very quickly. For example, for one of his victims, victim number 4, which was Katherine Eddowes, there was a police constable who passed through the square in which her body was found, and between 2 successive patrols through that square, which were only 14 minutes apart, Jack the Ripper managed to entice this lady into a darkened corner of the square. He managed to overpower her, render her unconscious, cut her throat, lift up her clothing, make a major incision into her abdomen, and then navigate underneath the stomach and through all the retroperitoneal fat, which is that in the back of the abdomen, and other organs, in order to actually locate her left kidney. So he managed to do all this basically with the body at ground level, rather than up on a dissecting table and in conditions of very poor light rather than under good light, and yet he managed to do all this in just 14 minutes. So this is a speed that would have put most medical students to shame. So quite clearly he had a degree of skill and probably experience at doing this, which was far in excess of any average person, and indeed also of normal medical students, I would argue.
Now, you also make links between the type of violence that people working in slaughterhouses must practice in order to kill animals, and violence that perhaps is perpetrated against other individuals in their lives at other times, for example, cases of domestic violence or cruelty against animals. What do you see as the link there between generalised violence and the work of the slaughterman?
Well, if you think about the role of the slaughterman, they have to obviously manhandle and subject a large number of animals to conditions which are obviously frightening and stressful for them, and then kill them. So it is intrinsically incompatible with viewing animals appropriately as sentient creatures who do experience fear, pain and stress, and who do not wish to die. If you view animals appropriately in these sorts of ways, it would make it difficult for you to actually fulfil the role required of you as a slaughter worker in East London in the 1880s, or indeed today, when hundreds and potentially even thousands of animals are killed on a daily basis in some of these large industrialised facilities. So I think this changes the people that work in these environments. There's strong economic pressures on them not to view animals in these sort of ways, and essentially to become completely desensitized to these living creatures, and in order to be able to treat them in the ways that they are treated. So this results in a hardening and a desensitization of the people that work in these environments. Now, we know from modern sociological studies that there's a strong link between the commission of violence toward animals and violence committed on people, vulnerable people, particularly women, children and elderly people. So we now know that most serial killers today have a prior history of animal abuse, and it's thought that this provides an opportunity for them to learn where to obtain weapons, how to use them, to practice on animals and become desensitized to the consequences of their action. They do all of this before they graduate onto humans, and it's referred to as the graduation hypothesis within the human animal violence literature. So we know that most serial killers have some prior history of animal abuse. We know that kind of animal abuse was occurring in slaughterhouses. On top of all that, we have a couple of major sociological studies from modern times showing marked increases in the most violent crimes in communities surrounding slaughterhouses, probably because of these effects on the workers. One of them involved a study of 581 US counties, another involved 248, so really big studies. And the most violent crimes are rape, for example. There's a 166% increase in rapes in communities surrounding slaughterhouses. So there are major spikes in violent crime rates in these communities, and that's not matched with other heavy industries that also have large proportions of young men, social disorganisation, people coming and going, high turnover. All the other heavy industries that were studied had no spikes in violent crimes, or there was a negative association. The only one that had a dramatic positive association was animal slaughtering.
Fascinating. So, Andrew, as you note, the Jack the Ripper's murders remain a very big unsolved mystery, something that intrigues a lot of people, and in fact there's a tourist industry that exists around it. Have you had any feedback yet from Jack the Ripper advocates or people who are curious about the issue on your theory?
We haven't yet. The mass media hasn't picked this up yet. There is a lot of interest. Within the United Kingdom, a new theory seems to be published about every 6 months, even though this all occurred in 1888. There are now more than 100 theories as to who Jack the Ripper might have been. So the interest in this case remains strong to this very day. But we have not had time, being the busy academics that we are, to actually get this to the mass media, and I expect substantial interest when we do get the time to do that and when they do pick it up.
Wonderful. Now, Andrew, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It's probably Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, the iconic text of the animal rights movement.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, actually, I was a veterinary student campaigning against harmful animal use within my veterinary curriculum. And I actually wrote a review of humane teaching methods and of the educational evidence indicating that students that use them usually do just as well as those that learn by harming animals, and indeed about 2/3 of the time seem to actually do better. So that was published in the journal ATLA, Alternative to Laboratory Animals, when I was a veterinary student.
Wonderful. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I guess one that I really admire is Professor Bernard Rollin from Colorado State University, because he has been causing controversy and taking on very controversial issues in the field of animal use within veterinary schools and animal agriculture. For 30 years he's been causing controversy, so I think that's a fine example to try to live up to. I've tried to cause controversy myself, but I've only done it for a relatively short time.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think we have a bit of a duty to show some leadership in this area. We have the good fortune to actually be educated about animals, about the characteristics of animals that mean that it's important for us to consider them morally. And as academics, people do look up to us a little bit, certainly our students and others in society, for expertise about issues. So I think there is an obligation on us to use that knowledge to try to essentially do good in the world, to try to teach others and to provide an example.
So, Andrew, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
One thing I would like would be for people to stop viewing human beings at the top of the hierarchy of moral consideration, because we like to have a bit of a hierarchy or a pyramid, and we place ourselves at the top of that based upon characteristics we attribute to ourselves, such as greater intelligence, greater capacity to change the environment around us, and so on. These things may indeed be morally relevant, but I think the one big thing that everybody's missing is that the likelihood that a species has for positively or negatively affecting other species, I think that's a characteristic of species which is also morally important. And if you consider that, then humans should correctly be viewed as being at the bottom of the moral hierarchy rather than at the top of the moral hierarchy. So I would ask people to stop putting humans on such a pedestal and to give some moral weight to the sheer amount of destruction that we are causing to the rest of sentient life. That's what I'd like to see.
Well, fascinating, Andrew. Thank you. So what are you working on next?
I've just finished this Jack the Ripper paper. We've recently had the full 10,000 word paper published, open access in Animals. I'm not currently working on anything yet. I've just arrived in New Zealand, actually, where I'll be working for the animal advocacy organisation SAFE, so I need to see what their priorities are. But there's a couple of ideas of things that have interested me for a long time. I'd like to update the global estimate of laboratory animal use. The best estimate that we have currently covers the year 2005, and I would also be interested in updating the review of educational evidence concerning the learning outcomes when students in the life and health sciences learn via harmful animal use versus humane alternatives. The last review we have in this field dates from 2007, so I would like to update that as well. Right.
How can people find out more about your work?
I've got a website, andrewknight.info. All my publications are there, and there's a link to short YouTube video clips covering a variety of topics in animal research and also vegetarian companion animal diets, which is something I've done a lot of work in.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us at Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal study scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can like us on Facebook, also at Knowing Animals. Finally, you know what I'm going to say. Don't forget to leave a review and to subscribe at iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.